The BOMARC Missile Accident, 1960. BOMARC Site RW-01 is a 75-acre fenced-off site, contaminated primarily with weapons-grade plutonium, highly enriched and depleted uranium. On June 7, 1960, an explosion in a CIM-10 BOMARC missile fuel tank caused the accident and subsequent contamination. The explosion occurred at Launcher Shelter 204, McGuire Air Force Base, Ocean County, New Jersey, approximately 16.1 miles south-southeast of Trenton, New Jersey. Launcher Shelter 204 was one of 54 located at McGuire, and was operated by the 46th Air Defense Missile Squadron. The missile, in ready storage condition, permitting launch in 2 minutes, was destroyed by explosion and fire after a high-pressure helium tank exploded and ruptured the missile's fuel tanks. In the official Department of Defense summary, it was stated that the nuclear warhead was also destroyed by the fire, although the high explosive did not detonate. Nuclear safety devices acted as designed. Contamination was restricted to an area immediately beneath the weapon, and an adjacent elongated area approximately 100 feet long, caused by the drain-off of fire-fighting water. This report turned out to be inaccurate, as indicated in a U.S. Air Force press release from McGuire Air Force Base in 2002. Specific details on the accident are outlined in a declassified letter dated September 8, 1960, as follows.
A broken arrow alert was received at 14:22 hours that a fire had broken out in a missile-ready shelter at McGuire Air Force Base. The belief at that time was that a possible one-point detonation had occurred and that an adjacent shelter was endangered by the fire. The 2702 EOD Squadron was notified to dispatch EOD personnel to the scene to render assistance. Detachment Number 4, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and Detachment Number 6, Griffiths Air Force Base, departed their stations en route to the incident. At 18:25 hours, information was dispatched from the site that a one-point detonation had definitely not occurred and that decontamination was underway. Detachment Number 4 then returned to Wright-Patterson.
The following is a resume of events as reported by the detachment commander, Detachment Number 6.
At approximately 15:15 hours, 2 explosions occurred in one of the ready missile shelters. When emergency personnel arrived at the shelter, the missile was burning and no attempt could be made to bring the fire under control. Water hoses were placed through the doors prior to evacuation of emergency personnel. All personnel not belonging to the emergency crew were evacuated from the missile site. Firefighting personnel were able to return to the shelter at approximately 15:45 and contain the fire. No alpha monitoring equipment was available at the missile site, and assistance was requested from Fort Dix Army EOD personnel for monitoring the immediate area. A survey for alpha, gamma, and beta was conducted on the area outside the shelter with negative results. A gentle wind, 5 to 8 knots to the southwest, was blowing the smoke off base. Smoke was blown over one adjacent shelter. This shelter did not become contaminated. At approximately 19:15 hours, personnel of Detachment Number 6, clothed in full protective clothing and Scott air packs, entered the area. The nose section of the missile was still smoldering. A water hose that had been braced in the doorway was directed toward the nose section. Approximately 1 inch of water covered the entire floor of the shelter. Water was flowing under the front shelter doors, down the street, and into a drainage ditch. The entire area inside the shelter and outside adjacent to the shelter was monitored. The highest reading obtained at this time was 250 CPM, directly under the warhead. The water apparently shielded any other readings. The instruments used at this time included the PAC-IS and YENPDR-27. The warhead had been engulfed in the fire and had been exposed to superheating. The explosive was completely consumed, and the pit had melted and dropped to the floor, mixed with a considerable amount of ash and miscellaneous residue. No explosive residue was found. Photographs were obtained and monitoring was suspended at 22:30 hours. Water was again released into the shelter and arrangements were established with the fire department to keep the area outside of the shelter wet during the night. The entire inside of the shelter was surveyed, and all readings indicating contamination were limited to immediately around and slightly forward of the warhead. The area was roped off and kept wet the rest of the day. Personnel entering the area were kept to a minimum, with an accident investigation team trying to determine the cause of the explosion and fire. On June 9, 1960, monitoring was resumed. Survey of the warhead residue was started at 1900 hours. A component was unbolted and removed without difficulty. The X unit was removed and the tritium bottle exposed. The tritium bottle appeared to be intact and in good condition. Approximately 2 inches of tubing remained attached to the bottle. The remainder was crimped off. The line was crimped and the end filled with inert gas and recrimped. The T290A was used to monitor prior to the crimping operations. All readings with the T290A were negative. A portion of the tritium bottle was covered with sticky material. It appeared that the substance came from a thermal battery. However, sample smears were obtained as a precaution. The warhead tritium bottle and residue from the floor were placed in sealed containers, again in plastic bags, and finally in cans. The cans were monitored on the outside and found to be free of contamination. A warhead container with the tritium bottle and remainder of contaminated residue were turned over to the nuclear personnel. The entire area inside and outside of the shelter was washed down with fire hoses. Care was exercised to prevent additional contaminated areas. On June 10, 1960, the entire area was again surveyed, and it was found that during the fire, tar had melted and had settled on sections of the floor in thin layers. Several of the areas indicated readings of over 2 million CPM. The clean area indicated 0 readings. The center of the road in front of the shelter also raised in contamination, reading to 2 million CPM. The entire area was again washed down and allowed to dry. When remonitored, a slight drop in contamination was found. A large portion of the roadway was still over the allowable limits. When completely dried, the inside of the shelter was painted. A very thick layer of paint was applied. The outside was painted, using brooms to spread the paint. When the paint had dried sufficiently to walk on, monitoring was again resumed. All areas that previously indicated high levels of contamination were effectively covered and 0 readings were obtained. A few places on the fringe area indicated minor readings of 50 to 500 CPM. This reading was determined to be non-hazardous. The EOD personnel terminated operations at 2000 hours on June 10, 1960. One item of concern was where the contaminated sluice water was going. The flow was traced, and it was found that after traveling slightly over 200 feet outside the fenced area, a total distance from the shelter of approximately 500 feet, the water was absorbed by the sandy soil. A suitable dam was constructed to ensure that the water did not leave the immediate area, and further, that it did not leave the military reservation. The water supply was not contaminated, and arrangements were made for regular inspections of the water supply.
It should be noted that the last statements concerning the distance the contaminated water had traveled, and that the water supply was not contaminated, were blatantly false. In fact, the runoff of the fire-fighting water not only ran downhill in a trench from the accident site, it went outside the fence, through a culvert underneath New Jersey Route 530, and on into a large area on the other side of the road. Plutonium is known to migrate underground, especially in groundwater. It can show up in areas and in drinking water, miles away from the accident site. The real issue was the fact that the plutonium in the ground was allowed to remain so, and no attempt had been made to find it and remove it until 2002. Subsequent radiological surveys conducted by the Air Force between 1960 and 1980 revealed contamination over a 7-acre area. Cost of the cleanup was estimated to be approximately $22.1 million and involved the removal of 20,800 cubic yards of material for disposal at a Nuclear Regulatory Commission facility in the state of Utah. In the late 1980s, public interest in the site raised congressional concern. In response, the Air Force committed funding for investigation and cleanup of the site. The Air Force signed a record of decision in November 1992 that selected removal of contaminated soils and structures as the preferred remedial alternative. The contract for removal was finally awarded to Duratech Incorporated of Columbia, Maryland and its subcontractor, IT. In the spring of 2002, work began to remove the contaminated soil and building debris, concrete and asphalt. The material was then transported via truck through Fort Dix and Naval Air Engineering Station Lakehurst, then by rail to Utah for disposal in a Nuclear Regulatory Commission licensed facility.
This was the largest amount of leftover radioactive residual material ever recorded from any United States accidents. Site contamination radiological surveys were conducted frequently after the accident by several different agencies around the BOMARC site, adding up to 21 separate occasions between 1960 and 1987. Water sampling was also conducted in the 1980s, early 1990s, and in 2000 to test for groundwater contamination. The final selected remedy includes, first, excavation of soils contaminated above cleanup criteria. Second, demolition and consolidation of structures contaminated above cleanup criteria. Third, transportation and off-site disposal of radioactive soils and structural waste. The BOMARC site on McGuire has been an object of controversy and attention, dating all the way back to when it started in 1959 to when it closed down in 1972. The U.S. military had to respond thoroughly and publicly in order to preserve the environment.
To date, approximately $22.1 million has been spent to remove and dispose of 20,800 cubic yards of soil and debris from the site. The investigation phase is continuing to determine if future remediation efforts are required in additional areas near the site.